Hello, I'm Dr. Robin Miller, and you're watching HealthDay's conference coverage exploring research with the world's leading medical professionals. Dr. Matthias Tschöp joins us to share exciting research he discussed at this year's American Diabetes Association's scientific session. Dr. Tschöp, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. My pleasure.
What are the significant milestones achieved in research this year with Tirzepatide Mounjaro in terms of weight loss and clinical obesity? And how do these results challenge previous assumptions in the field?
I think the transformative part about the Tirzepatide Mounjaro story is that it is allowing or giving us, on average, 23% weight loss. When I started as a young physician 30 years ago, this was unimaginable. There was nothing there to control body weight. So while Tirzepatide Mounjaro also gives very, very good results in terms of controlling blood sugar, actually having positive impact on lipids as well, the weight loss is really the game changer. And these dual agonists are hybrid molecules that can activate one or the other receptor. And in the case of Tirzepatide, it's a 5-to-1 ratio of GIP to GLP. So it's a GIP-heavy drug, which seems to be beneficial on several levels, and this is really what's now emerging, what's very exciting.
So how can the use of Tirzepatide and other co-agonists contribute to reducing the global pandemic of obesity and related disease?
My hope is that with the significant competition that's on the horizon, 12, 15 of these drugs being in clinical trials, there will be sort of a regulation that there is reasonable pricing. We also need to continue to work on making everybody understand that obesity and its consequences are serious health risks. This has economic impact. If we were able to, control body weight with these drugs, this would be a major economic benefit because we could prevent type 2 diabetes mostly. And imagine what that means. We could prevent many cases of cancer, of cardiovascular disease, all of which are consequences of obesity and its metabolic complications.
Looking at your previous research on effective therapeutics for obesity, what led you to identify ghrelin as the hunger hormone? And how did this discovery contribute to your understanding of metabolic control signals?
We discovered that there's a leptin opponent and looking for other factors. Ghrelin, a peptide from the stomach that we showed is a hunger hormone that increases body weight, works at the same places in the brain like leptin, but it's sort of a yin and yang balance thing. Again, disappointing. Blocking ghrelin didn't do the job either. But two things became clear. We gotta have something that acts on the brain. We've got to have a combination of signals. And the signals that are coming from the gut, that are responding to nutrients, they know where to go in the brain, and they're designed to systemically manage acutely metabolism and appetite. So this is why we went after combinations of gut signals, and only 20 years later, we then have these dual and triple agonists. And fingers crossed, several of them will hopefully be something that can be prescribed to patients to control obesity in the near future.
So how do you envision the future of metabolic medicine and the impact of your pioneering work in the field?
We have a new generation of drugs that we're working on and hoping to bring in the clinic where we deliver small molecules to certain organs, like targeting the liver in fatty liver disease, or only targeting the pancreas, or only targeting the brain, depending on what is needed. And then there's yet another frontier. I mean, with the success of these dual and triple agonists, Richard DiMarchi, the chemist I'm closely working with, and I, we are thinking we could use that same principle and apply it to other diseases, right? So, you may have heard that some people call Alzheimer's disease the diabetes of the brain. I mean, there's some similarities there. So could we target neurodegeneration with a different combination of different signals, but with the same success? So these are, it is still very exciting, and there's a lot to do. And can't wait where that leads us.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Tschöp.
It's my pleasure.
Dr. Adam Nelson, Associate Professor of the University of Adelaide, Interventional Cardiologist and Prevention Specialist, joins us to discuss his recently conducted research on cardiovascular preventive therapies in type 2 diabetes. Dr. Nelson, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Robin.
Can you briefly explain the design of your recent study on coordinated care to optimize cardiovascular preventive therapies in type 2 diabetes?
Yes, I will, Robin. Look, the important background here is that we know a number of therapies exist for patients with type 2 diabetes and established cardiovascular disease, yet they're profoundly underused in clinical practice. And we know the barriers around that have got patient, clinician, and system level contributions. So we designed a study, a multifaceted intervention to try and overcome those barriers at a clinic level and tested it in a cluster randomized trial design.
So, why is it important to assess the utilization of evidence based therapies in reducing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk in adults with type 2 diabetes?
We know patients with type 2 diabetes have an elevated risk of developing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, period. And we know that once it's established, it's more aggressive and has worse outcomes than those without diabetes. And we know that a number of therapies that exist have got established, proven efficacy, and yet, as I mentioned, are profoundly underused. And so, we thought that a intervention that would be addressed at a clinic level could improve the uptake more broadly at a population level.
And how do the results of this study align with or contribute to existing research on the underuse of evidence based therapies in clinical practice for adults with type 2 diabetes at risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease?
We looked in a number of different databases to understand the contemporary use to try and get a sense of the size of the gap that exists between what we know and what we do, this idea of implementation gap. In a study looking at an insured population in the US of around about 500,000 individuals with diabetes and ASCVD, we found that less than 1 in 30 patients were on 3 key classes of evidence-based therapies, that is a high-intensity statin, an ACE or an ARB, and an SGLT2 or a GLP-1, 2 agents we know of anti-hypoglycemic origins that have got CV benefit. So if we're to use those 3 key therapies as being tenets of high-quality care, less than 1 in 30, as I mentioned, were on those. We know that cost and access is a big contributor to the lack of adoption in some settings, and so we then looked in another population, which was through PROCORNET, the federated data model, in 300,000 individuals there, again the same, diabetes with ASCVD. Approximately 1 in 15 to 1 in 20 patients there are on each of those all three of those therapies.
So, what are the potential implications of the study findings for healthcare providers and their patients?
We established a intervention which involved the creation of a coordinate trio. So we had an endocrinologist, a cardiologist, and a QI specialist come and visit each of the 23 randomized intervention clinics. And we went to these clinics one by one and understood local barriers, and some of that related to education and literacy of these agents, particularly the SGLT2 and GLP-1 classes. We looked at some of the champions within the clinic, if there was a local pharmacist. We understood links to local endocrinology. And then we also looked to develop an audit and feedback trial that allowed clinicians to track their progress. We know that gamification or demonstrating the use against other benchmarks is a way to improve contemporary care practice. And so we did this intervention at a clinic level, and then over the course of 12 months, we showed that we could increase the prescription of these 3 therapies 4.5 times that compared to the control arm. That was an increase of almost 25%, absolutely, between the 2 arms.
And are there any plans for future research or studies to build upon these findings?
Robin, as exciting as the trial results are, and if you don't love your own research, no one else will, but as exciting as this research is, we had 1,000 participants and so 500 in intervention arm, 23 clinics. That's a drop in the ocean. And if all we do is move the needle in 500 patients, then we've failed. So we really need to look at ways in which we can scale this. The intervention was multifaceted. It had lots of components to it, but each of them were low touch and small, and in and of themselves are very easily scaled. And so we now need to work out, how do we take this from 23 clinical trial sites into the community?
And lastly, what's your opinion on injections such as Ozempic and their effectiveness in reducing the risk of major cardiovascular events in individuals with type 2 diabetes?
Look, Ozempic is one of the classes of the GLP-1 receptor agonist. We see significant benefit, particularly in MI and stroke, which we don't see necessarily in SGLT2 inhibition. These are agents that take a little more learning, and the inertia to overcome is slightly higher amongst cardiologists. No, it sits in the armament, certainly for a contemporary cardiologist in improving the care of patients with diabetes. It's important, Robin, to recognise that a third of the patients we see in cardiology clinic have got comorbid diabetes, and over half of the inpatients we treat in the heart failure service have got some form of abnormal glucose. So treating the cardiovascular disease without managing the diabetes is forest from the trees.
How is it that an interventional cardiologist gets interested in preventive cardiology?
Robin, I'd like to think that we're all preventive cardiologists, but I just personally really love preventive cardiology. I think that in coronary disease, we're moving away from a lesional or focal approach to managing. Certainly, it's got a role for symptoms, PCR, but recognising that the systemic therapies around lipid lowering, antithrombotics, and now the sort of more pleiotropic mechanisms around anti-hypoglycemic agents mean that we've got so much more to offer than just in interventional cardiology per se. So, look, my research and systems-based thinking is all around prevention, and I think it's a very exciting space. Emerging therapies is really the future.
Thank you for your time today, Dr. Nelson. You've been watching HealthDay's conference coverage. Thank you.